Tonight, we begin in a world that is very quiet, not silent in the way an empty room is silent, but quiet in the way evenings used to be. Deep, wide, and unbroken. There are no sudden sounds of notifications, no distant traffic humming through the walls, no voices traveling invisibly through the air, only the soft sounds of a home settling for the night. A wooden chair shifts as someone stands. A door closes gently. A faint breath of wind touches the outside of the house. And beyond these walls, darkness spreads slowly across the land. In this world, distance is something you can feel. If someone you love lives far away, their voice does not exist in your evening. Their laughter does not drift into your home. Their words cannot reach you after sunset. They are somewhere else, under another sky, living a life that unfolds without your sound in it. For most of human history, this was normal. When the sun went down, the world grew smaller. Homes became islands of candlelight floating in a sea of darkness. Families gathered close, not because they planned to, but because light only reached so far. A single flame on a table could illuminate a meal, but it could not chase away the vastness outside. Windows showed little more than night. Roads disappeared into shadow. Voices carried only as far as breath, and open air allowed. And so evenings belonged to those who were physically present. You could speak with the person beside you. You could hear footsteps in the hallway. You could listen to the fire settle into embers. But beyond your walls, the world might as well have been another planet. If a son had traveled to another town, if a friend had moved to a distant city, if a parent lived across a stretch of countryside, their voice was gone from your daily life. You might picture them. You might think of them often, but you could not hear them. And hearing, after all, is one of the most human comforts. To hear someone is to know they are alive in that moment. To hear a voice is to feel closeness, even across a table. But in this earlier world, voices were bound to bodies, and bodies were bound to place. Distance meant absence, and absence meant silence. Communication did exist, of course, but it moved slowly, like the turning of seasons. A message could travel by horse, carried in a satchel across long roads, or by ship, crossing water under open sky, or by messenger, walking mile after mile with careful steps. But the message was never a voice. It was ink on paper, a memory of sound, not the sound itself. So evenings were not interrupted by calls. No sudden ringing, no unexpected voice from far away, no urgent news delivered in an instant. News arrived like weather, slowly, gradually, sometimes too late. And because of this, people lived in a different rhythm of connection. When someone left your home, you did not expect to hear from them soon. You carried their last words with you. You remembered the sound of their voice in your mind, but the real, living voice would not return until the person did. This made departures heavier, but also more meaningful. Goodbyes lasted longer. Hugs held a little tighter. Because once someone walked down the road and out of sight, they slipped into a kind of gentle quiet, not forgotten, not lost, but beyond reach. Imagine an evening in such a world. The sky darkens slowly. The last light fades behind distant hills. A family sits at a wooden table lit by a candle. The room is warm, but the world outside feels vast. There is no expectation that the evening will bring new voices. No one far away will suddenly enter the room through sound. The night will unfold exactly where you are. Stories might be told, clothes might be mended, Bread might be prepared for the morning, but all of it happens within a small circle of light and presence. The mind does not wait for interruption. It rests in what is here. And in this stillness, something interesting happens. People become deeply aware of absence. They think of loved ones not as voices they might hear tomorrow, but as memories they must carry quietly inside. A mother might sit by the fire and think of her daughter in another village. She does not expect a call. She does not imagine a sudden voice from nowhere. Instead, she remembers the last time they spoke face to face. She remembers the tone, the expression, the warmth. Memory replaces immediacy, and so the emotional landscape of the evening becomes slower, deeper. There is longing, yes, but also patience. Life teaches people to live with distance as a natural part of existence. Even urgent news travels slowly. If someone is ill in another town, you may not know for days. If someone has married, moved, or changed their life, the knowledge arrives long after the moment has passed. This may sound sad to modern ears, but it also created a different kind of calm. Without constant updates, yet the mind did not stretch itself across miles every hour. Attention stayed close to home. The night belonged to the room, the fire, the quiet voices nearby. Outside, the world slept in darkness, each home holding its own small circle of life. Travelers on the road at night moved carefully. There were no lights calling them from afar, no glowing signs of connection, only stars overhead and the sound of their own footsteps. In such a world, hearing a distant voice would have felt like magic, but that magic did not yet exist. Sound was local, immediate, tied to breath and presence. A shout could travel across a field, a bell could ring through a village. But even these sounds faded quickly into space. Nothing carried a human voice across towns in real time. The air belonged to nature, not messages. Wind moved through trees. Rain touched rooftops. Owls called in the distance. But no one could whisper across miles. So people learned to live with a gentle kind of separation. They developed rituals of farewell and reunion. They wrote letters with care, knowing each word mattered. They valued face-to-face meetings deeply, because hearing someone's voice was not ordinary. It was rare, precious, and tied to physical presence. Even inside a house, sound behaved differently. Walls were thicker, rooms darker. Voices did not compete with background noise. When someone spoke, others listened. When the house grew quiet, it truly grew quiet. There was no faint hum of electricity, no hidden network carrying conversations in the air, only breath, fire, and the small sounds of living. In this setting, the idea of speaking to someone far away and hearing their reply instantly would have felt almost impossible, like speaking to the moon and hearing an answer come back. Yet the human desire to connect across distance was always there. People looked at roads stretching toward the horizon and wondered about the lives unfolding beyond sight. They stood by harbors watching ships disappear and thought of voices lost to the wind. They wrote letters late at night, hoping their words would cross the dark safely. Even then, long before wires and ringing bells, there was a quiet wish in the human heart. To reach farther than the body could travel, to hear beyond the limits of the ear, to make distance feel smaller. But for now, in this early evening world, that wish remained only a dream. Homes stayed wrapped in silence once the doors were closed. Families finished their day without interruption. The night air moved freely, untouched by signals. And somewhere, far beyond the hills, someone else sat by their own small light, also thinking of voices they could not hear. The world was full of people connected only by memory and imagination. The sky stretched wide and dark above them all, and between one voice and another lay miles of a quiet land. This is where our story begins. In a world where distance meant silence, where evenings belonged only to those in the room, where the human voice had never yet learned to travel through a wire in the dark. And as the candle burns lower and the house grows still, we rest for a moment in that older kind of night, a night untouched by ringing bells, a night where the only voices are the ones already near. After the sun had set and the world had grown small again, there was one quiet way to reach beyond the walls of a home. It did not travel through the air. It did not arrive instantly. It did not carry the sound of a living voice. It traveled folded, sealed, carried by hands that did not know the writer. It was the letter. In a world without telephones, letters were the long, slow bridges between distant lives. When someone wished to speak across miles, they sat at a table, often in the evening, with a small pool of light from a candle or oil lamp. The room would be still. Perhaps the faint crackle of firewood, perhaps the soft breathing of others already asleep. And in that quiet, a sheet of paper waited. Writing a letter was not rushed. Ink did not flow endlessly. Every word required a small, careful movement of the hand. A pen dipped into ink, a pause to think, a slow line of handwriting forming across the page. The writer could not simply speak and correct themselves. They could not send a second message moments later. What was written would travel far, and it might be the only message the reader received for weeks. So words mattered. People chose them with care. They described ordinary days in detail, because those details were the closest thing to presence. They wrote about weather, about harvests, about small events that, in another time, would never be mentioned. But here, these details became precious. A letter might say, "The evenings are growing colder now." Or, "The cat sleeps by the stove each night." Simple sentences, but they carried the feeling of a place, and the rhythm of a life continuing far away. When the letter was finished, it did not yet begin its journey. First, it had to be folded carefully. Paper was not always cheap or plentiful. Ink took time to dry. Some letters were sealed with wax, pressed with a signet ring or a small stamp. The seal was not just decoration. It was protection, a way of keeping private thoughts safe during the long trip. Then came the waiting. The letter left the quiet room, but the voice inside it did not arrive quickly. It might travel by horse, bouncing gently in a leather bag as hooves struck the road. It might cross rivers on small boats, or seas on ships that moved slowly with the wind. Storms could delay it. Broken wheels could delay it. Illness, weather, and distance all stretched time. For the person who wrote the letter, life continued. Days passed, and meals were eaten. Work was done. But in the back of the mind, there was a soft awareness. My words are somewhere out there, moving through the world without me. And for the one waiting to receive it, the waiting itself became part of life. They might walk to the edge of a village each day, looking for the arrival of a messenger. They might ask travelers if any mail had come. Often there was nothing, just the same road, the same wind, the same sky. Waiting was not dramatic. It was quiet and patient. People did not expect immediate replies. They expected silence between letters. That silence was normal. It did not always mean worry. It meant distance. When a letter finally arrived, it was a small event. Hands would open it slowly. Eyes would move carefully across the page. The reader might pause often, imagining the voice behind the words. Because the letter did not speak aloud, it required memory to give it sound. A daughter reading her mother's letter would hear her mother's voice inside her mind. A friend reading a message from afar would remember the tone, the laughter, the pauses. Letters asked the reader to participate in the act of hearing. They were silent objects that carried echoes of voices, and once read, a letter did not disappear. It could be folded again, placed in a drawer, tucked into a box with others. People kept letters for years. They reread them on quiet evenings, touching the paper that someone else had once touched. In this way, letters made time feel layered. A voice from months ago could return in the present, not as sound, but as memory made visible. Sometimes letters carried joyful news, a new child, a safe arrival in a distant city, their successful harvest. Other times they carried sorrow, illness, loss, changes that could not be undone. But even sad news traveled slowly. By the time a letter arrived, the event described had already settled into the past. This softened the moment in a strange way. Grief still came, but it came wrapped in distance and time. Letters did not bring sudden shocks in the night. They arrived in daylight, held in the hand, opened with breath and quiet. Because communication moved slowly, people learned to live with uncertainty. They did not know every detail of distant lives. They filled the gaps with imagination. A brother away at sea became a story in the mind. A friend in another town became a figure in memory. Absence was not filled with constant updates. It was filled with thought. Even the act of writing a letter created a pause in life. And to write, one had to sit still. To remember, one had to slow down. To describe daily life, one had to notice it first. Letters made people observers of their own days. They turned small moments into shareable memories. A sunset, a broken tool, a new neighbor, all could become part of a letter, traveling far beyond the room where it was written. And yet, for all their beauty, letters had limits. They could not carry tone perfectly. They could not answer questions immediately. If something urgent happened, a letter might arrive too late to change anything. So life remained local. Even with letters, distance still felt wide. The world was connected, but only by thin threads of ink and paper moving slowly through space. Evenings remained mostly uninterrupted. A letter did not arrive at midnight. It did not ring like a bell, and it waited quietly in a bag or satchel until someone carried it to a door. This gave nights a particular calm. After the light was lowered and doors were closed, no distant voice could suddenly enter the room. The world beyond the walls was still far away, and so the age of letters was an age of patience. Connection existed, but it moved at the pace of footsteps and wind. People lived with long stretches of not knowing, and they grew used to it. Hope traveled with letters. So did longing. But both were gentle, stretched across time, like the slow fading of daylight. When a reply was written, the cycle began again. Another quiet evening, another page, another careful choice of words, another small voice folded into paper, sent out into the wide, waiting world. In these years, before wires carried sound, before bells rang in the night, and human connection depended on stillness, on sitting down, on thinking carefully, on trusting that somewhere, someday, these written words would be opened under another small pool of light. And for now, as we rest in this slow-moving world, we can feel the gentle rhythm of it. Write, seal, send, wait, a pattern as soft and steady as breathing in the dark. For a very long time, sound belonged only to the air. A voice could travel across a room. It could drift across a field on a still day. It could echo along stone walls or disappear into trees. But always it faded. Sound was something that lived and died in the moment. It could not be captured. It could not be sent far away. If you wanted to hear someone, you had to stand near them. Your ears and their voice had to share the same space. This had always been the rule. And then, slowly, quietly, people began to wonder, what if sound did not have to stay where it was born? In the 19th century, the world was already changing in other gentle ways. Wires had begun to stretch across land, carrying something invisible, electricity. Electricity itself was mysterious. It could not be seen as it moved, only felt through its effects. A small spark, a twitch of light, a pulse through a wire. At first, these wires were used to send simple signals, short pulses that could be turned into messages. These early electrical messages were not voices, they were patterns, dots and lines, a code that had to be translated. It was useful, yes, but it was still far from hearing a human voice. Yet the idea lingered. If electricity could move signals, could it move something more delicate? Could it carry the shape of a sound? Sound, after all, is made of vibrations. When you speak, your vocal cords move. They push air into tiny waves. Those waves travel outward until they reach another ear. What if those waves could be turned into something else? Something that could travel along a wire? This question did not arrive as a sudden revelation. It grew slowly in the minds of curious people who spent their days listening, watching, and experimenting. Rooms filled with small devices, thin wires stretched across tables. Metal parts rested beside wooden boxes. These were not loud places. They were quiet rooms of careful attention. Someone might tap a surface and listen, might pluck a string and watch it vibrate, might speak into a small opening just to see if anything changed at the other end. Early experiments were full of stillness and patience. Nothing dramatic happened at first, and no clear voice leaped out of a machine. Instead, there were faint sounds, buzzes, clicks, strange tones that hinted something was happening inside the wire. The people working on these ideas did not always know what they were hearing. Sometimes the sounds were weak, almost like whispers from inside a box. But even those faint noises carried a kind of promise, because they meant this: something from one place had reached another place, not through air, but through a line of metal. Imagine the moment someone first realized that a vibration made by a human voice had traveled through a wire and appeared somewhere else. It would not have sounded clear. It might have been distorted, thin, barely recognizable. But it would have been enough. Enough to make someone sit very still. Enough to make them lean closer and listen again. A voice, even a broken one, coming from a distance with no person in the room. That was new. That was strange. That was the beginning. These early sounds were not yet conversations. They were glimpses, hints that the boundary of distance might not be as firm as it once seemed. The air had always been the home of sound. Now, slowly, wires were learning to carry it too. The process required patience. Devices had to be adjusted, materials changed. Small pieces moved a little closer or farther apart. Each change brought a slightly different result. A clearer tone, a stronger vibration, a sound that lasted just a bit longer. The work was not about speed. It was about listening. Listening for the faintest improvement. Listening for a human quality in a mechanical sound. And then, one day, in a quiet room filled with wires and simple tools, a voice crossed a distance in a new way. Not carried by breath through open air, not written in ink, but transformed into an electrical pattern sent along a wire and turned back into sound somewhere else. It was not loud, it did not shake the walls, but it changed something invisible in the world. For the first time, the human voice had stepped beyond the limits of air. It had traveled as energy. Those who heard it may not have fully understood what it meant yet, but they felt it. A small moment of stillness, a pause, a realization that distance might begin to soften. At first, these early voice-carrying devices were delicate and experimental. They were not placed in homes. They were handled carefully, like fragile instruments. But the idea had been proven. Sound could ride on electricity. A voice could leave one room, enter a wire, and emerge in another place entirely. This did not make the world loud. It did not suddenly fill nights with noise. Instead, it introduced a new possibility. That presence might one day travel farther than the body. In the beginning, the experience must have felt almost unreal. To speak into a device and know that someone elsewhere might hear you. To listen to a small receiver and recognize a familiar voice even though the person was miles away. It was like hearing an echo from another world, soft, thin, but alive. The air was no longer the only path for sound. Wires began to hum with a new kind of potential. And yet, everything still moved slowly. These early systems were not everywhere. They did not ring in every house. They were rare, quiet experiments that hinted at a different future. But for those who stood in those rooms, who leaned close to strange wooden boxes and metal parts, who heard a distant voice carried by electricity for the first time, the night must have felt slightly different, as if the space between places had become just a little less empty, as if the silence between two people far apart might one day be filled with something warmer than memory. A voice, traveling not through wind or paper, but through a thin line stretching into the dark. And so, in these careful experiments, in these quiet rooms filled with wires and patience, sound met electricity, and the world, without making a sound about it, began to grow a little smaller. At first, the telephone did not belong to ordinary rooms. It lived in offices, workshops, and places where business was done. It was a tool before it was a companion, a device for messages, not for evenings. But slowly, almost quietly, it began to move toward the home. Not every home, not all at once, just here and there, in certain houses, a new object appeared on the wall. It did not glow, it did not move, it did not demand attention. It simply waited. The earliest home telephones were often mounted on a wall, usually in a hallway or near a doorway. They were made of wood and metal, with a small mouthpiece fixed in place and a separate receiver that hung on a hook. They looked more like small cabinets than modern devices. To someone seeing one for the first time, it might not have been obvious what it did. There were no screens, no buttons arranged in neat rows, just a box, a cord, and a quiet presence. Homes in that time were already filled with useful objects. Tables worn smooth by years of meals, chairs shaped by generations of sitting, lamps that flickered with soft light. The telephone joined these objects not as something flashy or new, but as something strange and still. People did not gather around it for entertainment. They did not check it constantly. It stood apart, almost respectfully, as if it knew it was entering a world that had always been quiet. In the evenings, life in the home continued as it always had. Meals were cooked slowly. Voices stayed low. Light remained gentle. The telephone did not change this rhythm overnight. In fact, for long stretches of time, it did nothing at all. Days could pass without it making a sound. Its presence was potential, not activity. This made it different from most objects in the home. A stove gave warmth, a clock marked time, a chair invited rest. But the telephone waited for someone else to act, and that someone else was not even in the house. The idea that another person, somewhere far away, could suddenly enter the quiet of your home through this object was still unfamiliar. Because of this, early telephone use was careful, almost formal. When people spoke on the telephone, they did not chatter. They stood upright. They spoke clearly. They kept conversations brief. Part of this was technical. Early connections were not always clear, but part of it was emotional. Speaking into a device that carried your voice into the unknown felt unusual. You could not see the other person. You could not read their expression. You listened harder. You chose words more slowly. A telephone conversation was not like speaking across a table. It was more like sending your voice into a tunnel and waiting for it to return. In many homes, the telephone was shared by the whole family. There was no privacy in the modern sense. If it rang, everyone heard it. Someone would step forward to answer, often while others stayed nearby, curious and attentive. Children might be hushed. Chairs might pause mid-scrape. The ringing itself was rare enough to feel important. Unlike today, where calls are constant and expected, a ringing telephone once meant something specific. News, a request, a moment of connection. It was not background noise. It was an event. And because calls were not constant, the silence between them remained deep. Even with a telephone in the house, evenings were still mostly uninterrupted. There were long hours where nothing happened. The fire settled. The wind moved outside. Someone turned a page in a book. The telephone rested on its hook, silent and still. In this way, the first telephones did not erase quiet. They lived inside it. They became part of the landscape of the home without overwhelming it. If anything, they added a new layer to silence, the possibility that it might be broken. This possibility changed how people thought about distance. Before, someone far away simply did not exist in your evening. Now, they might. Not always, not even often, but possibly. This small shift altered the feeling of separation. A son working in another town was no longer entirely unreachable at night. A friend in the city could, in certain moments, speak directly into your quiet room. Distance was still real, but it had begun to thin. Some homes placed the telephone in a central spot, where its sound could travel easily. Others kept it in a hallway, slightly apart, as if unsure where it belonged. And it was both part of daily life and slightly outside it. Not quite furniture, not quite decoration, something in between. When a call came, there was a short ritual. someone lifted the receiver. They spoke into the fixed mouthpiece. They said hello slowly, carefully. Voices often sounded distant, faint, touched by static or soft echoes. But they were voices, not ink, not memory, living sound, arriving from somewhere else. After the call ended, the receiver returned to its hook. The room fell quiet again, and life resumed. In these early years, the telephone did not compete with other evening activities. It did not distract people from one another. It did not fill every silence. Instead, it stood as a bridge that was only crossed occasionally. This made each crossing meaningful. Families might talk about a call long after it ended, and they might repeat what was said, describe the tone of the voice, wonder about the place it came from, because hearing someone far away was still new enough to be remarkable. Over time, as more homes gained telephones, the idea of distance shifted gently, not suddenly, not dramatically, just enough that the night felt slightly less isolating. If something happened, good or bad, it might not have to wait for a letter. A voice could carry the news. But even then, the world did not become noisy. Calls were expensive, lines were limited. People did not use the telephone casually. It remained a tool of intention. You called when there was a reason. You answered when it rang. And between those moments, quiet filled the house as it always had. In some ways, the telephone deepened people's awareness of silence. Because now, his silence was not just emptiness. It was the space between possible connections. A pause in which the world might reach in, or might not. At night, when lamps were dimmed and doors closed, the telephone rested like any other object. It did not glow in the dark. It did not whisper. It waited. And in that waiting, it seemed almost patient, as if it understood that human life still moved at the pace of footsteps, meals, and rest. The first telephones in homes did not rush the evening. They entered it gently. They allowed distance to soften, but they did not erase it. They brought voices across miles, but only when invited. And so the home remained what it had always been, a place of light against darkness, a shelter for those inside, a quiet world of its own. Only now, sometimes, in a voice from beyond the walls could step softly in, speak for a moment, and fade again into the night. Before people grew used to it, before it blended into the background of daily life, the sound of a telephone ringing was something entirely new. Homes had always been full of familiar sounds, the creak of wooden floors as someone crossed a room, the soft clink of dishes being stacked after a meal, the low murmur of voices in the evening, the settling sigh of a house cooling after the day's warmth. Outside, there were other sounds, wind moving through trees, a distant dog barking, footsteps fading along a road. All of these sounds belonged naturally to the world people understood. But the ring of a telephone did not belong to that world, at least not yet. It was mechanical, sharp, sudden. It did not come from wind, wood, or human breath. It came from a device on the wall. The first time it rang in a home, it must have startled everyone inside. A bell inside a box, sounding without anyone touching it. Not a knock at the door, not a voice calling from outside, a sound from within the house, triggered by someone far away. Imagine a quiet evening. A family sits in lamplight. One person reads, another mends clothing. Someone else simply rests, listening to the soft crackle of fire. The air is calm. The night presses gently against the windows. And then, a sudden metallic ring breaks the stillness. It is not loud by modern standards, but in a world of deep quiet, it cuts through everything. Hands pause, eyes lift. For a moment, no one moves, because the mind must understand what the ears have just heard. A sound with no visible source, a signal without footsteps, and something calling from nowhere. Early telephones often used small bells inside the wooden case. When electricity traveled down the line, it triggered a tiny hammer to strike the bell. The result was clear and bright, a ringing that felt both urgent and mysterious. At first, people did not rush to answer. They hesitated, because the sound did not yet feel familiar. It felt almost alive, as if the house itself had spoken. In earlier times, sudden sounds at night often meant danger. A crash, a shout, a knock. The telephone ring joined that category at first, something unexpected that demanded attention. But unlike other sudden sounds, this one carried no immediate explanation. No person stood outside the door. No animal had knocked something over. Just a small device on the wall, vibrating with sound. Someone would finally step forward, in slowly, as if approaching something that might disappear if touched too quickly. They would lift the receiver, hold it to their ear, and speak. And from the other end would come a voice, sometimes faint, sometimes crackling, but undeniably human. In that moment, the mystery shifted into wonder. The ring was not an alarm. It was an invitation, a voice traveling across distance, asking to be heard. Still, it took time for people to grow comfortable with the sound. In the early days, a ringing telephone could make a whole room tense. Conversations stopped. Hearts beat a little faster, because every ring meant interruption. Not the constant, casual interruptions of modern life, but a rare break in the natural flow of the evening. The ring did not belong to routine. It belonged to the unexpected. Some people grew to love the sound. It meant news, connection, the chance to hear someone far away. Others found it unsettling, a reminder that distance was no longer quiet, a reminder that the outside world could suddenly step into the room. Children were often curious about it. They might stare at the telephone, waiting to see if it would ring again. They might ask how a voice could make a bell move inside a box. Adults did not always have clear answers. Electricity still felt mysterious. The ring seemed almost magical, a sound summoned from miles away. Over time, the household learned the rhythm of it. They noticed that calls often came at certain hours. Business calls during the day, personal calls in the early evening. Late-night rings were rare and therefore more serious. Because the ring was uncommon, it carried weight. People did not call casually. If the telephone rang after dark, it might mean important news. So the sound never became meaningless. It remained a signal worth listening to. In some homes, people described the ring differently, not just as noise, but as a presence. The telephone is calling, they might say, as if the device itself had a voice. And in a way, it did. It was the first object in the home that could suddenly speak for someone who was not there. This changed how people felt about space. Before, the walls of a home were clear boundaries. Outside sound stayed outside. Inside, sound stayed inside. But the telephone blurred that line. A ring meant someone beyond the walls had reached in. Not physically, but audibly. Distance folded inward for a moment, then unfolded again once the call ended. Even after people grew used to the sound, it never fully lost its character. It remained bright and distinct, a small bell cutting through quiet, In houses with thin walls and little background noise, the ring could be heard from nearly every room. Someone upstairs might call down, "The telephone!" Footsteps would follow, a receiver lifted, a voice carried across space. Then silence returned. The ring also created a new kind of anticipation. On evenings when someone expected a call, the quiet felt different. Every small sound might be mistaken for the bell. A spoon set down too firmly. A chair leg scraping the floor. People listened more carefully, waiting not just for silence, but for a specific break in it. This waiting gave the evening a new texture. Still calm, still gentle, but with a thread of possibility running through it. The ring did not happen often, but when it did, it tied two places together for a moment. A house in one town, another house far away, two quiet rooms linked by a sound. And when the call ended, the bell fell silent again. The device returned to stillness, but the memory of the ring lingered. It had carried something invisible, a reminder that the world was no longer as distant as it once seemed. Over time, the sound of the telephone became part of life, but in the beginning, it was a visitor, a metallic voice announcing the arrival of another human voice, a small bell that marked the moment when silence gave way to connection. And in those early nights, when homes were dark and the world outside was wide and quiet, the ring of a telephone must have felt like a thin line of sound stretching across miles of darkness, finding its way into a single waiting room. And there is something deeply human about a voice. Before words are understood, before faces are remembered, we recognize the sound of those we love. A voice carries more than language. It carries mood, breath, warmth, and presence. For most of history, to hear a voice meant one thing. The person was near. They were in the same room, or standing just outside, or calling from across a field. Distance erased sound. Miles of land, hills, forests, rivers, all of it stood silently between one voice and another. But when telephones entered homes, something quiet and extraordinary happened. For the first time, a voice could arrive without a body. A person could be far away, in another town, another city, perhaps even another country, and still speak into the quiet of your evening. The first time someone heard a familiar voice through a telephone, it must have felt almost unreal. Imagine lifting the receiver in a dimly lit hallway. The house is still behind you. A lamp glows softly in the next room. You say hello, and then, faintly at first, you hear it. A voice you know. Not perfectly clear, not exactly as it sounds in person, but close enough that your heart recognizes it before your mind does. For a moment, you forget the wire. You forget the device. You simply hear someone you care about speaking to you from somewhere beyond the walls. It is not like reading a letter. A letter carries thoughts, carefully arranged and delayed. A voice carries life in real time, breathing between sentences. A pause while searching for the right word. A small laugh that was not planned. Even the imperfections matter. The crackle of the line, the slight echo, the fading and returning of sound. And these remind you that the voice has traveled. It has crossed distance, moved through wires and darkness, just to reach your ear. Early telephone conversations were often simple. How are you? I arrived safely. The weather here is cold. Ordinary words, but behind them was something extraordinary. Presence. For a few minutes, two people far apart shared the same moment. They spoke and heard each other without waiting days or weeks. Time folded inward, distance softened. In many homes, the first long-distance calls were emotional experiences. A mother hearing her son's voice after months away. A friend speaking to someone who had moved far from home. A family connecting across towns separated by long roads. The conversation might be short. The sound might be faint. But the feeling lingered long after the receiver was placed back on its hook. The room seemed different afterward. Quieter, perhaps, but also warmer. As if the voice had left a trace behind. People often spoke more gently on the telephone than in person. They leaned slightly towards the receiver. They listened with care, afraid of missing a word, because the connection felt fragile, like a thin thread stretched across a wide space. No one wanted to break it with careless speech. These early calls also changed how people imagined distance. Before, a loved one far away existed mostly in memory and thought. Now, they could suddenly exist in sound. You could hear their breath, their tiredness, their happiness. You could sense their mood in a way letters could never fully convey. A voice from far away was not just information. It was presence, traveling. In the quiet of evening, this presence felt especially powerful. Night had always been a time of separation. Darkness widened the feeling of distance. But now, in the dark, a voice could cross that distance. A small sound traveling along a wire, finding its way through fields, towns, and shadows, arriving in a softly lit room. There must have been moments when people closed their eyes while listening, letting the sound of the other person fill their imagination, seeing their face in the mind, feeling for a brief time that the miles between them had thinned. When the call ended, there was often a pause. The receiver returned to its place. The house grew still again, but silence was no longer quite the same. It had been shared with someone far away. The quiet now held an echo, not an audible one, but a memory of connection. In this way, the telephone did not just carry voices, it carried reassurance. To hear someone was to know they were there, living, breathing, existing in the same world at the same time. This comfort was new. In earlier times, you might wonder about someone far away for weeks. Now, in a few moments, you could hear their voice and feel close again. Even short conversations mattered. A simple good night carried across miles could bring peace to the heart. A brief laugh shared through static could lighten a long day. The voice did not need to be clear. It only needed to be recognizable. Over time, people began to rely on this new kind of closeness. Not constantly, not casually. Calls were still rare and intentional. But they knew it was possible. They knew that, if needed, a voice could travel. And that knowledge itself changed how distance felt. The world remained large. Roads were long. Journeys took time. But now, thin wires stitched places together in a quiet network of sound. Homes remained calm in the evening. Fires still glowed. Lamps still flickered. But somewhere in the background of the night was a new possibility. That someone far away might speak and be heard. The telephone did not remove longing. It did not erase absence. But it softened them. It allowed small bridges to form across the quiet. A voice from far away was not the same as a hug, not the same as sitting beside someone at a table, but it was closer than silence, closer than memory alone. It was presence carried on a current, arriving softly, lingering briefly, then fading back into distance. And in the gentle rhythm of those early years, when nights were still dark and homes were still quiet, These traveling voices became part of the texture of life, not loud, not constant, just occasional threads of sound woven through the fabric of evening, reminding people that even across miles of darkness, they were not entirely alone. At first, the telephone was a small thing, a device on a wall, a bell in a hallway, a voice traveling between two nearby places. But voices wanted to travel farther, and so, slowly, quietly, the world began to change shape. Not through roads or buildings, but through lines, thin, quiet lines stretching across land and sea. Wires. They did not glow. They did not hum loudly. They simply rested in the open air, connecting one place to another. In the early days, these wires followed familiar paths. They ran alongside roads where horses once carried messages. They crossed fields that had known only wind and birds. They stretched from town to town, linking small communities together. People walking beneath them might glance up occasionally, seeing the dark threads against the sky. To some, they were just part of the landscape. To others, they felt like signs of a new, invisible world forming above their heads. Each wire carried something fragile, not packages, not people, but sound, voices, reduced to tiny electrical movements, sliding silently along metal paths through open air. Inside homes, the telephone still sat quietly on its hook. But now, if someone lifted the receiver, their voice might travel not just to a nearby building, but to another town entirely. Distance began to stretch, but connection stretched with it. As the network grew, so did the quiet rooms that helped make it possible. Telephone exchanges appeared in cities and towns. Inside these buildings were rows of switchboards, large panels covered with small holes and cords. Operators sat before them, often in long lines, wearing headsets and listening carefully. Their work was gentle but constant. When someone lifted a telephone receiver, a small signal reached the exchange. An operator answered, asked where the caller wished to connect, and then plugged the cord into the right place. In this way, human hands helped voices find their path. These rooms were not loud in the way factories were loud. Instead, they were filled with soft sounds, clicks of plugs, quiet voices speaking into microphones, the low murmur of many conversations passing through unseen lines. And it was a place where distance was quietly folded and unfolded all day long. Outside, wires continued to spread across valleys, over rivers, along coastlines. Tall poles carried them high above the ground. Birds sometimes rested on them, unaware that beneath their feet, voices were traveling. Storms bent them. Ice weighed them down. Wind made them sing softly in certain weather. But they remained, stretching farther each year. Eventually, wires began to cross water. At first, rivers, then wider and wider bodies of sea. Laying cables under oceans was slow, careful work. Ships carried long lengths of insulated wire and lowered them gently into the deep. These cables rested on the ocean floor, hidden in darkness, carrying signals between continents. It is a quiet image. Thin lines of metal resting beneath miles of water, while fish swim above and currents move endlessly around them. Yet through those silent paths, human voices traveled. A person in one country could now speak to someone in another, their words moving beneath waves and across vast distances. The world did not grow louder because of this. If anything, it grew more quietly connected. Homes still had their calm evenings. Lamps still flickered. But now, the potential reach of a voice had expanded beyond imagination. The network of wires did not rush. It grew step by step, town by town. Each new connection brought a subtle shift. Places that once felt far apart began to feel slightly closer. A journey that took days by train could now be bridged in minutes by voice. And yet, conversations remained thoughtful and measured. Calls were still precious, still intentional, and the wires made connection possible, but people still chose when to use it. In the countryside, poles carrying telephone lines became part of the horizon. They stood in rows, marking roads and fields. In cities, wires crisscrossed above streets like delicate webs. To some, they were signs of progress. To others, they were simply there, unnoticed. But everywhere they went, they carried the same invisible cargo: human sound, laughter, news, comfort, questions asked and answered. The network did not belong to any single person. It belonged to everyone who lifted a receiver and spoke. And yet, most of the time, it rested quietly, like a sleeping system, waiting for voices to wake it. At night, when fewer calls were made, the wires lay still under the stars. Wind moved past them. Moonlight touched them faintly. But inside, no voices traveled, as the world above and below them remained dark and calm. In this way, the network mirrored the rhythm of human life. Busy during the day, gentler at night, always present, but not always active. The idea that voices could cross oceans and mountains would have seemed impossible not long before. Now, it was simply part of the world. Not loud, not dramatic, just there. A quiet web of connections stretching across continents, from one small house to another, from one city to the next. And through it all, the evening remained a time of rest. Even with the wires spanning the world, the home still felt like a small island of light. The difference was this: the island was no longer entirely alone. Somewhere beyond the dark fields, beyond the distant hills, beyond the curve of the earth itself, another small light burned in another home. And between them ran a thin, silent line, waiting. Evening has always been a gentle boundary. The work of the day slows, light softens, voices grow quieter. For most of history, once night settled in, the world beyond the home faded into distance. Roads darkened. Windows reflected only the room itself. What happened elsewhere would wait until morning, or longer. But when telephones entered homes, evenings began to change in a way so subtle that many people hardly noticed at first. The darkness outside remained. The lamps still glowed softly. Chairs were drawn close to tables, and the fire still murmured in the hearth. Yet something invisible had shifted. Before the telephone, evening meant separation from the wider world. Once doors were closed, the night belonged only to those inside. Conversations stayed within the walls. Our news from elsewhere rested somewhere far away, traveling slowly by road or rail. With a telephone in the house, that boundary grew thinner. The evening was still quiet, but it was no longer entirely sealed. At first, the change was more emotional than practical. Most nights, the telephone did not ring. Hours passed in the familiar rhythm of small domestic sounds, the turning of pages, the clink of a cup placed on a saucer, the low murmur of a final conversation before sleep. But now, there was a new layer beneath that quiet, a possibility. Someone far away might reach you. That knowledge alone altered the feeling of night. In earlier times, if you thought of a loved one in another town during the evening, the thought stayed inside your mind. You might wonder what they were doing, whether they were warm, whether they were thinking of you too. After the telephone, That wondering sometimes carried a gentle hope. Perhaps they might call, or perhaps you might call them. Distance no longer felt like a closed door. It felt like a door that could open, even if it usually stayed shut. This did not make evenings busier. In fact, many homes kept telephone use modest and intentional. Calls were often planned, made at certain hours when people expected to be home and free to speak. The telephone did not yet create constant interruption. Instead, it added small points of connection to an otherwise calm stretch of time. An evening might unfold as it always had. Supper finished, dishes washed, chairs pulled closer to the fire. Then, at a certain moment, someone might say, "I'll make that call now." The act itself became a quiet ritual. A person would step into the hallway or corner where the telephone hung. They would lift the receiver gently, speak to an operator, or dial slowly if the system allowed. Others in the house might lower their voices, not wanting to disturb the fragile thread of sound traveling outward. For a few minutes, the evening expanded. The room remained still, but the conversation reached beyond it, to another house, another lamp, another quiet room somewhere else. When the call ended, the person returned. What did they say? Someone might ask, and the voice from far away would be described, its tone remembered, its news shared. In this way, one small connection rippled through the rest of the household. Evenings also became more flexible. Before, plans made during the day stayed unchanged until the next meeting or letter. After the telephone, small adjustments became possible. A visit could be confirmed, a delay explained, a safe arrival announced. This did not rush life. It softened uncertainty. Instead of wondering for days, people could sometimes know within minutes that someone had reached their destination, that a train had arrived, that a journey had ended safely. The telephone also changed how loneliness felt at night. Evenings can be the quietest hours emotionally. Work is finished. Distractions fade. Thoughts grow louder in the stillness. Before telephones, if someone felt alone at night, there was little they could do about it, except wait for morning or write a letter that would travel slowly. With a telephone nearby, there was a new option: to hear another voice. Not always, not casually, but sometimes. And sometimes is enough to change the texture of a feeling. A short conversation could bring comfort. A familiar laugh through faint static could make a room feel less empty. The silence afterward would still be there, but it would carry the warmth of recent connection. Telephones did not replace face-to-face gatherings. People still visited neighbors, still sat together in the same rooms. But they added another layer to the social fabric of the evening. Friendship could now stretch across miles without waiting for daylight. Family ties could be refreshed with a call rather than only with letters. Even the idea of checking in began to take shape. A simple call to hear a voice and know that all was well. The presence of a telephone also made homes feel slightly more open to the world. Before, once night fell, the outside was mostly absent. With a telephone, the outside could gently enter. News of weather, travel, or events in other places could arrive while the evening was still unfolding. This did not erase the calm of night. It simply wove a few more threads into it. In some homes, evening telephone calls became a routine. A certain day of the week, a certain hour after supper. People would sit near the telephone a little earlier than usual, listening not just for the usual sounds of the house, but for the ring that signaled a familiar voice. Anticipation joined the quiet, and when the call came, the connection felt like a bridge lit briefly across darkness. Afterward, when the house settled again, the night felt fuller rather than interrupted. Telephones also changed how people ended their days. Before, saying goodnight to someone far away meant writing those words on paper and trusting they would be read later. Now, sometimes, goodnight could be spoken and heard in the same moment. A voice at the end of the day, a simple wish for rest. This small exchange made the night feel shared, even across distance. Still, the essential character of evening remained. Light low, voices soft, movements unhurried. The telephone did not shout. It waited, and because it waited, it fit into the rhythm of the home rather than overwhelming it. The most important change was not noise or speed. It was emotional reach. Evenings became a little less bounded by walls, a little less isolated, a little more connected to unseen lives unfolding elsewhere under the same dark sky. The night was still night, but it was no longer entirely alone. Somewhere, beyond the fields and hills, another home might also be settling into quiet. Another lamp might glow, and another family might be finishing their day. And between those two quiet rooms, a thin line of wire might be resting under the stars, ready, if needed, to carry a voice across the darkness. That possibility, gentle, patient, and rarely urgent, was enough to change the feeling of evening forever, not by making it louder, but by making it feel just a little closer. Now the house is quiet again. The evening has settled into its final stillness, the kind that comes not all at once, but in gentle layers. A chair has stopped moving, a book has closed, footsteps have faded down the hallway. Somewhere, a lamp still burns, low, warm, patient. The telephone rests on its hook. It has done its work for the day, or perhaps it never rang at all. Either way, it waits in silence. Earlier in the evening, voices may have traveled through it. Laughter, news, small reassurances. Or perhaps it simply stood by, a quiet possibility that was never needed. Now it belongs to the night, like everything else in the house. Outside, darkness stretches across fields and roads. No cars pass, no doors open. The world beyond the walls has grown wide and distant again, as it did before wires ever crossed the land. But something has changed in that distance. It is no longer empty. It is threaded, gently, invisibly, with lines that carry voices when called upon. Tonight, those lines are still. Somewhere far away, in another house under the same sky, another telephone rests in shadow. Perhaps it too hangs in a quiet hallway. Perhaps a lamp nearby casts a small circle of light. The people in that house have also finished their day. Chairs pushed in, windows dark. They too have stepped into the softness of night. And between these two quiet homes, yours and theirs, a wire lies stretched across miles of sleeping land. It does not hum loudly. It does not glow. It simply exists, patient and calm, ready to carry a voice when morning comes. Inside the room, the air is warm. Wood holds the memory of daytime light. Fabric rests where it was folded. Shadows gather in corners, deep but gentle. The telephone, once a strange newcomer, now feels like part of the furniture of life, not demanding attention, not glowing with signals, just present. Earlier in history, night meant a complete closing of the world. Beyond the walls was only darkness and distance. Now, even in stillness, there is a sense of quiet connection. Not active, not urgent, simply possible. And you might imagine the path a voice could take if it needed to. From this room, into the receiver, along the wire, across fields silvered by moonlight, past sleeping towns, into another home where a lamp still glows faintly. A voice traveling not in wind or echo, but in a thin line of energy, crossing the night without disturbing it. And yet tonight, no voice travels. The world rests, the wires rest, homes rest. This is the gentle balance the telephone brought to evenings. Not noise, not constant connection, but the knowledge that silence was now shared. Silence no longer meant isolation. It meant rest between moments of reach. The lamp flickers once, then steadies. A floorboard cools and gives a soft, familiar sigh. From somewhere deeper in the house comes the quiet rhythm of breathing. Sleep is arriving, slow and certain, and the telephone stands nearby, still and dark, its small bell quiet, its wires stretched peacefully under the night sky. If it rings tomorrow, a voice will travel. News will cross distance. Warmth will move from one room to another. But for now, there is only this calm, a home at rest, a world connected yet silent. Miles of land beneath the stars. The night holds everyone gently in place. And somewhere, in the quiet of the dark, thin lines stretch across the earth. Not pulling, not calling, just waiting. Ready, when needed, to carry a human voice softly through the night.